Hello and welcome to Technically Speaking, where scientists and engineers come together to chat about common interests, share knowledge and satisfy some curiosity. I'm Laura and I'm joined by Antonia and Jasmin to talk about activism, rebellion and whether scientific facts can play a part in these activities. So Antonia, this is something that you're interested in because you suggested this as an idea for the topic, so tell us about your interest.
So I've been working in the whole reducing carbon emissions, sustainability thing for a while. It was one of the motivations for me studying chemical engineering at university. When I left university and I was looking for a job, I was keen to not join an oil and gas company, or at least a company that exclusively worked in something like oil and gas. Then some people, protestors, some activists, take it to another extreme, like Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion, who have occupied different parts of the UK, including a large majority of bridges and roads in London, all at the same time, which understandably caused a lot of chaos and didn't make them super popular.
You probably have the same values as Extinction Rebellion. Stop kicking out greenhouse gases.
Perhaps.
But your action to combat that is very different.
Yeah, and how does that work? How does annoying the public make people want to fight climate change more?
The most recent thing I saw was still a while ago. They were didn't they start climbing on trains in London so people couldn't get to work because it was during rush hour?
That doesn't sound great, because arguably you want people to be able to take public transport. On the other hand, they could be saying, why do we continue to feed the capitalist machine that all in all also increases carbon emissions?
Exactly. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later on when we get into our meaty discussion. Jasmin, what's your interest in activism, or is it specific to climate activism as well, or is it slightly different?
General activism. So I work at a university, so I've had some engagement with student activists or staff who are involved in activism in terms of mostly phasing out fossil fuels. Something that sometimes we get climate protesters when there was an event hosted by an oil and gas company, or there was a speaker. We had a speaker from an oil and gas company, so quite used to seeing climate activists. Yeah, that's why I'm interested in whether science and activism can mesh well together and whether or not they're complementary towards achieving the goals that activism wants to set out and what science wants people to use it for.
Because I've worked in the nuclear industry, so I've seen some of this as well from working on a nuclear licensed site. I guess they'd already established ways in which they would protest against nuclear, and it was basically they'd stand outside main gate holding something that everyone had to read on their way in, which kind of slowed down people getting to work.
Did they have to read it?
I guess you probably could have said no, but even just, stopping people to ask them probably did slow them down. I have no idea what effect this had on operations. People were used to it. Jasmin, you said that you've come across it at the university, so can you tell us more about it and whether they did use science in their activism?
In 2007, when Heathrow had plans to expand the airport, there were quite large protests by climate activists who were really against the expansion of the UK's aviation sector and including expansion of Heathrow. And as part of their protest, they actually sellotaped to themselves and had banners saying, "We are armed with peer-reviewed science," I believe is what the banner said. And yeah, they had sellotaped to themselves. It wasn't the actual journal paper itself, but they had strapped to them a white paper that was basically the same material as the journal paper that basically showed that expansion of the UK's aviation sector is not compatible with the UK's need to basically cut its emissions.
The white paper, that was produced by is it the Tyndall Centre? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, the Tyndall Centre.
Yeah, and it was for Friends of the Earth, wasn't it?
I believe the white paper was commissioned by Friends for the Earth, but the journal paper that was published based on the research was peer-reviewed.
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense because the Tyndall Centre is really well known, it's really prestigious, so they would be doing things that would be able to be peer-reviewed.
Yeah.
I did wonder if the work was sort of funded by Friends of the Earth or whatever that relationship was, if the research was communicated to Friends of the Earth and their various supporting entities in some other way, because I understood very little of that report. I'm not a climate scientist. There's no reason why I would necessarily.
Well, when I read through the report, I understood it, but then again, I do work in this field. The main messages of the report is basically that expanding aviation sector is not compatible with carbon reduction targets, which back in 2007 was 60% for the UK.
60% of what, sorry?
Okay, so back in 2007, the UK government's carbon dioxide reduction target was to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide alone by 60% by 2050. That has now been revised because of the Paris Agreement and other net zero pledges.
Okay, so they're aiming for a more ambitious reduction, but still with air travel expanding as it is.
Yeah, so they were arguing that expanding the aviation sector is not compatible with achieving any reductions in greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in total. Interestingly enough, the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions have actually decreased since then, but mostly because the power sector has been decarbonising, so just basically phasing out coal and increasing renewable capacity.
Yeah, which is, I keep being told it's relatively easy to do that, but what is called deep decarbonisation, which is getting rid of any carbon or CO2 emitting things, is way more difficult.
Yeah. The emissions from the aviation sector have massively grown, and they've well surpassed what was initially predicted back in 2004, 2007. So yeah, there is work going into how to decarbonize the aviation sector, because they're realizing that they really need to decarbonize and decarbonize quickly.
In that respect, the activists were probably quite right in sellotaping the Friends of the Earth report, which was then turned into a peer-reviewed article to use as an evidence.
But here's the thing. In that case, that worked. But do all protesters come armed with peer-reviewed news? And do they need to be? In Extinction Rebellion's case, they've got some quite clear goals, such as the UK government needs to announce a climate emergency and treat it more seriously, essentially. How do we make that happen? Because scientists have been saying we need to reduce our emissions. Me and Jasmin will have seen all these papers which kind of say this is what the total cost of this industry is to climate change, and it is not compatible. And yet things still push forward. Jasmin, you were looking at fracking or shale gas production when you first did your PhD.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, we haven't gone down that route. But how much of that is thanks to research, and how much of it was the protesting? Because locals were protesting, saying, we're getting earthquakes, what could happen to our water quality?
Yeah, I think in a case of shale gas for the UK, it was a combination of just the very strong opposition from the communities who would have been close to the sites that were being investigated for shale gas potential, but it's also just the scientific evidence of that it's not economical to do it in the UK.
So I would have thought, given what Antonia just said about it could affect water supplies and it might lead to earthquakes, the residents are making those claims based on what they've heard about the science somehow, whether that's peer review or media.
The earthquakes were also something that they experienced, so...
Yeah, they didn't need evidence. They lived it.
Oh, so there was actually fracking going on and then they stopped?
Yeah. They were doing test hydraulic fracturing, and yeah, there were earthquakes experienced.
Was it known beforehand that it could cause earthquakes?
Yes.
And they did it anyway, okay. So the science was kind of ignored in that
Yes.
case, and it was the residents.
At the time, there was very little regulation around it. I think the argument was that because it was a very small scale hydraulic fracturing, because it was a test well. I forget the name of the site.
Preston New Road?
Preston New Road, that's the one.
Okay, so in that instance, it wasn't necessarily the science that convinced the UK to change its policy, it was the residents. And I feel like that happens quite a lot. It is the local population that kind of rebels against what a government or an organisation is going to do. And I guess that extends to non-science topics as well.
We see it in other social change, that people have disruptive protests, and key thing is non-violent protests. I think throughout history we've kind of seen the women's vote and the suffragettes movement, Martin Luther King and getting equal rights for black people and abolishing segregation. It seems like that kind of stuff worked, and it wasn't working until key moments happened and kind of forced policy.
So that can't have just been a lot of people said no, and that was that. Because I'm pretty sure there are other instances in history where, despite people not wanting something, it happens anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's very true.
There must be some, there must be some rebellions that work and some don't. They must have different tactics.
Yeah, so I tried to find some science, some evidence about it. Admittedly, because they're not really things that I often read journal articles about, I did kind of struggle.
They are quite a lot different to the physical science journals, I will give you that.
Oh, yeah. The way they give evidence is a very different way. And, well, the whole thing is just structured differently. You're expecting, like, a methodology. I did find one article which reports on a survey that academics in the sociology, political science, and that kind of area of research, and they asked them what made different social movements more successful, and they sort of graded different aspects in terms of their importance. One of the conclusions was disruptive protesting is actually quite important for success.
So it doesn't necessarily matter who you target it at as long as you state your demands.
Yeah, they said it's important that they're sustained, but not necessarily widespread. So they might have backlash from the public, so it might not be a popular thing, but if it is disruptive, that is useful.
Is that because it still draws attention to it? Like it gets the media interested because people are disrupted, and that kind of, as a science communicator, I would say that then gives a news hook for the scientists to come in and say, here's why this thing is important.
That was the interesting thing. Sometimes it's not all about getting media attention either. It's about bringing a certain topic to the forefront, which sounds like a contradiction, but it's doing it in such a way that it's about awareness, not necessarily about public support. It's like putting it on the table for debate.
Makes sense, I guess.
Well, I assumed it was to convince voters, like it convinced the masses to vote for the policy change they want to see. But actually it's not. It's sometimes just about getting it in front of the decision makers.
Did you come across a research paper that was published in January this year that was about social change? So I think it kind of feeds into what you're saying.
Yes, I did. It's a little confusing because it's not necessarily an article. It says comment, but it still has points and it's still in a peer-reviewed journal. So I presume it has some weight to it.
Yeah, so comments are just commentary from an expert on a particular area.
Okay. And did you read this article as well?
I started to read some of it. What I found amusing was they were essentially telling activists that they should disrupt the elite when they work for two elite universities. The authors were at University of Massachusetts and Yale in the United States. Yale's really prestigious and really elite. What they were saying, they'd taken an example from history about racial inequality. And they'd said that the way that it became more effective to have racial integration wasn't necessarily because there was lots of protest against it. It's because certain areas of black society, I think, kind of mobilized against the people that had a lot of power. So several big companies say that they were the labor force for that company. And they kind of made the company realize that they couldn't really continue without black people coming to work.
It was a labor strike, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I think the point the academics were making was that they weren't trying to influence the policymakers. They were trying to influence the people with the money that could exert their power on politicians and policymakers. So going back to the point of Extinction Rebellion disrupting people trying to get to work, they're disrupting the labour force. Whether that would have an effect on big companies like,
Amazon.
Yeah, or Virgin or Google or something, I don't know. Because it doesn't seem like a very targeted way of affecting the labour force.
I'm trying to think of a way Extinction Rebellion could stage a protest against Amazon.
So people have talked a lot about, don't buy from this company, in light of certain things such as the Israel attack in the Gaza recently. Was it October last year?
Yeah, October 4th.
And people are saying, don't go to Starbucks. And you think, how is Starbucks related to a Middle East conflict?
Technically, Starbucks isn't on the official boycott list.
Oh, is it not?
No, they're not. They're just in the media a lot.
Oh.
Ariel, Siemens, they're on the list.
So why are they on the official list, those companies?
So Siemens, they supply technology to Israel's defense force. They also supply technology to other countries' defense forces. And Ariel, that's a detergent used to wash soldiers' uniforms.
Okay.
I feel like that's kind of tenuous.
Yeah, that isn't the link I was expecting.
Well, it's like anything that's supporting Israel, basically.
But I wonder how much difference it would make. I feel like you'd have to do the financial analysis. Like if it's only, 1% of the financial support, doesn't necessarily matter. Can you categorise them?
Like we do with climate modelling, I think you could do a similar with economics,
To see what the biggest disruption would be for a particular action.
Yeah.
I like it. Chemical engineering style analysis of activism.
When a chemical engineer attempts to do economics.
Hey, we could do economics. Techno-economic analysis. Well, 1/5 of my thesis was economics.
So we're talking a lot about disrupting an economy essentially to affect social change, which I guess is kind of related to science from what you guys were saying. Well, from the engineering point of view, the work that you've done, but also because the science can help create products or whatever that can shape an economy or show that a particular effect is happening. I've got to say, though, having read some of these journal articles and understanding that there are tactics that can have a meaningful effect, it might kind of sway me to take more disruptive action. So at one end of the scale, you've got fairly passive boycotting particular companies. And then at the other end, you've got Extinction Rebellion chaining themselves to things. People glue themselves to various buildings and things like that, don't they?
Yeah. In Chris Packham's documentary of should we break the law in response to climate inaction, people from Just Stop Oil got orange paint, threw it on, I can't remember which governmental building. It was related to some legislation they were protesting, and then sat and waited for the police. They didn't run away. They were waiting for the consequences for the arrest.
But it would draw more attention to it, wouldn't it? If you think of the headline that so many people got arrested for this, what looks like a bit of a daft stunt, but has a genuine reason behind it. If they just ran away and didn't get arrested, would anyone know? They've suddenly got the weight of, the police saying they were arrested rather than them just doing something.
This veers me towards going off topic on the changing of policing of protests and stuff.
I feel like there might not be a lot of science or engineering behind that, though. I did come across a journal article, though, that was kind of related to why people might believe in a certain cause. And it was essentially saying that if there's an information vacuum, then people will take on board whatever is put in front of them. So you keep talking about things appearing in the media a lot. This specific one was about the anti-vaccination movement and how the people that tended to align with it were doing so because they didn't have the science in front of them in a way that was understandable. So it was kind of playing to emotion instead of scientific fact. So in the balance of fact versus emotion, which is more compelling?
How scary is it that it plays on your emotion, And the worst thing is, this science that kind of started the anti-vax movement, I want to call it, I guess.
Are you saying science in quotation marks there, which you can't
Yes,
see?
Sorry, yes. I was saying science because it was a research study with made-up results that got later disproven.
Yeah, and it's been completely discredited.
This guy had a patent. What was his name now?
You can just call him Dr. Anti-Vax.
Dr. Anti-Vax. Andrew Wakefield. We're talking about the MMR vaccine and the fear around it causing autism.
Allegedly, according to this fabricated study.
Which, is this proven? Not true.
Also, the doctor, the lead author, who is basically Dr. Anti-Vax, he's not a paediatrician. Nothing involving children, nothing involving, autism. He's like a gastroenterologist. He's a stomach doctor.
But then again, how many people, the general public, will just see, oh, that person's a doctor? It's kind of like me standing up and saying, oh, I'm going to talk about climate science, but I know nothing about climate science in enough detail to talk about it with authority.
I think something about the anti-vax movement particularly that makes it slightly different from other movements is that there's just a lot of media publicity about it, and also a lot of celebrities, some that you could consider A-list, really jumped on the bandwagon about anti-vax, and there still are. That's probably why there's people who still think that vaccines either cause autism or they're secretly ways the government are trying to microchip you.
I think it's also kind of compounded a few things. There was the fear of alleged high risk of developing autism, but then other things that people just didn't want in related to vaccination, such as when we had COVID-19 and people didn't want to have a restricted freedom of movement and go into lockdown. They also fought against being vaccinated because they said, oh, well, this vaccine has been developed too fast, so we don't think it's safe. But in reality, I don't know if that was a genuine concern. I think it was a convenient excuse.
Thinking about things from the nuclear industry as well, there's a lot of the idea the media portrays is that nuclear is bad, and that's not necessarily the case. And when I've asked members of the public what their thoughts are on it, they've said, nuclear waste is not really bad. But when I ask them why, they don't necessarily know why they form that opinion. It just kind of is. And there are instances where this general idea that isn't founded in any evidence has helped shape national policy in some cases.
I've seen a video essay by ContraPoint who talks about, well, I think it was about cancel culture first, but I think it can be kind of applicable in that things get contracted. So instead of, this MMR vaccine allegedly could increase the risk of autism, it becomes contracted to vaccines cause autism. And I think similar things could have happened to the dilution of nuance in the nuclear, which is nuclear waste is a problem because of various things. And then just nuclear waste is a problem.
Another reason why especially the MMR causes autism movement was so strong was just that the age that kids get the MMR vaccine, it overlaps with the age at which children start to show signs of autism. For parents who did get their kids vaccinated and then saw that their kids were developing signs of autism, there would be a link if you didn't know anything else about it.
It's like that reporting bias.
So there were people that experienced it, which then spread through word of mouth, I guess, and it became a thing that wasn't grounded in science necessarily.
Yeah.
So it kind of seems like in a lot of cases, the scientific evidence isn't necessarily as important as, I guess, the message that you're sending out and the wording that's used to make people care. So being emotive.
There was a recent show by Joe Lycett, which was, I think, Joe Lycett versus the water companies.
Well-known comedian, right? And does a lot of things where someone has a problem and he kind of pursues it for them.
Correct, yes. I'm trying to remember the name of the show now.
I've definitely heard of it, and I also can't think of the name.
Joe Lycett's Got Your Back.
Ah.
So he did I guess this is kind of like a special, because it was Joe Lycett versus sewage. And there had been news articles coming out for a while that water companies were releasing sewage into our waterways, rivers, lakes, ocean, sea, all that kind of stuff. But this show that Joe Lycett did was this year, and I think that must have raised way more awareness than all the articles had done.
When we were kids, there were still people protesting about quality of especially water in the seasides, and sewage was being discharged. Even back then, there's still interviews on the TV of people about why they still discharging sewage into our seas.
So I guess there are two tactics there. There's either get an awful lot of people to have one voice or get a celebrity to have the voice for you.
Yeah.
I assume Joe Lycett would have some facts to back up if he's going to a company that's emitting waste and he's explaining what they're doing and why it's bad, and there's some scientific analysis behind it.
I think then, in a way, there wasn't too much science in that. It was quite widely reported in news and from people who worked in the industry saying that this was a problem. So I think it was kind of a lack of enforcement, really, that meant it was a well-known issue, but just not enough awareness was made around it.
Okay, so in that case, Joe Lycett just brought the awareness to an already known thing, so that the information was already there. There wasn't an information vacuum, it was just drawing attention to it.
Yeah, I think so.
Fair enough. Near the start, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, Antonia, and do they need to use science to shape their cause and get people to listen, or can they just go out and do stuff? Given what we've learned in this conversation about their tactics and what sort of information you may need, do you have a more informed opinion on that now?
Yeah, I think what I've learned from reading about the topic is you do need to kind of have both the public and the decision makers or people who influence the decision makers to be on your side. like having the knowledge would definitely help because it gives credibility. I still don't emotionally agree with some of the tactics, but there is evidence that some of them work.
I guess not all tactic works on every person.
Yeah, but from history, a body of evidence has shown that some of those unpopular tactics are effective.
And what about you, Jasmin? Because you said you've seen some activism from your university or from people within your university, I think. Can you kind of see why they're doing it and does it make sense to you?
So it's a mixture of like staff and students, and I think the general, like if I had to sum up why they're deciding to like choose activism, I think it's because they're just like fed up of the slow pace of positive action towards basically meeting climate change goals, but more specifically divesting from fossil fuels and cutting out fossil fuels in the UK's just like general energy and other consumer habits.
I suppose if I was to be on the other side, they'd still need the evidence to show that it is achievable, because a lot of people still think decarbonising is really expensive and they don't like it because in the short term it's expensive. And in the long term, it pays off because then you don't have to have climate adaptation or less extreme climate adaptation.
But there are still lots of people that don't think the climate emergency is a really serious problem. They think it's all going to be okay. How do you convince them without these sort of extreme pressures from various groups? If they're not going to listen to a climate scientist or 100 climate scientists saying the science shows that we are doing terrible things and it will affect your business, maybe it takes a bunch of people standing outside their gates and disrupting their work to add to that pressure.
Maybe peer pressure them.
I've already seen that. I've already seen climate protesters.
But did that change your mind?
I just wanted to get to work.
Yeah.
And also, I agree that climate change is serious.
And I guess in that instance, they're not trying to convince Jasmin, they're trying to convince the Chancellor of the university or whatever the correct phrase is there.
I think maybe this is where we do pressure them through emotion that, everyone else cares about this. It clearly matters to a lot of people. And you want to upset that many people or go against the best interests of that many people. But they're convinced that they're right. So if I had the answer to how to convince people to take climate action, oh boy.
It would take a whole load of different voices because each person is influenced by different things, right? Like I listen to debates and I tend to side with the person that makes the most rational, factual argument, not the person that's just really emotive and almost shouting down their microphone. But that's me. I'm a rational, fact-based person. Someone else might have been completely convinced by the other side of the argument. I guess maybe the point is if you want to affect meaningful change at the sort of national policy level, you want to figure out what will influence those decision makers and work back from there, whether it is emotion or it's influencing certain companies that have economic sway or it is disrupting a local population. I think that's what I'm taking out of this episode. And I think that's probably quite a good point to end it on. So this has been a really interesting discussion about how science and emotion and fact can work in separate ways to influence people. So we'll see you next time. The views expressed in this podcast belong entirely to the person that said them. They do not represent any industry or organisation. If you enjoyed listening to these views, it would really help us out if you could rate us, leave a review and tell a friend. This podcast was sponsored by no one, but if you're interested in funding us to continue to have frank discussions about science and engineering, please get in touch.